All right, hello, and welcome to part two of the AdTech Antitrust Primer. So, thanks to all 500 of you who watched episode one. It was fun to make, fun to get your feedback and see your likes on YouTube. I guess I should say, remember to subscribe. We will do another part now that's guaranteed because we wanted to talk about the complaint and take people through the complaint, but we thought it would be fun and illuminating because a lot of the complaint is about header bidding to speak to the inventor or one of the inventors of header bidding. He's an investor in my company, Chalice. His name is Brian O'Kelly. So Brian's our guest here on part two. If you don't know who Brian is, well, he's an ad tech legend, sometimes called the Godfather of Adtech. He was the CTO, Chief Technology Officer of Right Media, which is remembered as the first, some say the second, ad exchange. And then he was founder CEO of AppNexus, one of the first and definitely one of the most important DSPs. He ended up selling it to AT&T for $1.6 billion. Today, that technology is the property of Microsoft. Brian went on to found and lead Scope 3, one of the first or the first companies committed to the reduction of carbon emissions by ad tech technology. We're going to talk to Brian in a minute, but at first I wanted to do a little primer. Brian goes straight into the weeds, so I wanted to make sure everyone knows a few terms before going in. So, all right, we're going to be talking about header bidding because Google's reaction to header bidding is a big part of the antitrust complaint. So to know what header bidding is, you have to know what a header is. Well, very simply, a header is the top of a web page. And the reason it's important that the header bidding is at the top of the web page is because the top of the web page loads first. So when we talk about header bidding, we're talking about a race to be the first technology loaded onto a page. You also have to know what an ad server is. And to teach what an ad server is, I always tell two stories from my distant past. Straight out of college, I worked at a newspaper, and the newspaper published weekly. And the day the newspaper was published, all these couriers would show up with the ads that were going to be in the newspaper. They sort of had a photo negative or sometimes like a little silkscreen cutout of the ad if it was simple. Those would be brought back to where the newspaper was being laid out. They would paste the ads onto the page where they belong, right in the squares and rectangles around the content, and then the newspaper would be sent off to the publisher at the end of that night. So the newspaper published the ads. The ads had to be brought to the publication to be published. And one of my first jobs in advertising was filing what are called tear sheets. Tear sheets are when you go to the newsstand and you buy the newspapers for the advertising agency that placed those ads, just to make sure they showed up. And when you find them, you tear them out and file them away as proof that these ads show up. All right, so in the beginning of digital, people not knowing any better, they did things the same way. They would deliver ads on discs to publications, and they'd expect the publication to send them a report about how many times the ad showed up and base the billing on that. So ad server solves both these problems: a piece of technology where the ad lives and from which it's served. So instead of just the publication publishing the web page, the publication has a content server, which serves the text of the content, the videos or whatever, and an ad server, which publishes the ads. So the advertiser and publisher are working together to create that page, and the advertiser gets their own record of every time this page showed up and data about the ad impression, as it's called, what time it was, what region it was, some technographics about the user who was loading the page. So that's what an ad server is. And a quirky thing about how the ad tech market played out is that Google ended up with most of the share of ad servers by around 2008, where Brian starts his story. Google had acquired one of the big ad servers, DoubleClick, and by 2008, most of the other ad servers weren't doing much business or were on the decline. The other important thing to know is what publishers are trying to do, right? How do publishers make money? Once digital starts to become competitive around ads, the publisher's job is to have as many advertisers competing for every ad impression as possible to drive the price as high as possible, right? So the publisher is trying to get more and more demand competing to drive up prices and get higher prices in ad tech are CPMs, the highest price per thousand ads to make the most money. So the entire story the Google antitrust trial is around publisher monetization and publishers' attempts to drive prices up to make more money. Now, cut that. Okay, now people who work in programmatic often don't know much about ad servers. And that's because later, around 2010, there starts to be a layer built above ad servers. So I'll describe what each of these layers are. The second one being the open RTB layer of SSPs and DSPs. So ad servers were pretty simple technology. When an ad server is called, it serves, right? So it's kind of a binary. If there's something on the page that has the direction to call an ad server, that ad server will be called and the ad is served. In the SSP DSP layer, it really is the same technology of as an ad server, except it has two functions. It sends out a bid request saying, I'm loading, someone is loading the page and you have 100 milliseconds to bid, and then all the demand bids, and then a winner is selected, the highest bid, and their ad server is called and that gets served. So there's a lot of, everyone who works in ad tech today is involved heavily in this DSP, SSP layer, bid requests, and bid responses and all the data transfer that goes on in there. But behind it still, the foundation is the ad server. So especially at the beginning when Brian is talking about hacking the ad server, think of a piece of tech that if it lights up, you pull the trigger, that's it, the ad serves. So a lot of the original hack was dealing with that problem early on when you're trying to, as Brian was, trying to start a demand side platform in the early days. So when you hear Brian say the phrase tag on page, that's referring to that trigger, right? A piece of code on the page that when it gets loaded and tells the ad server to serve the ad. That's what tag on page refers to. So with that, if you got all that information, I think you're ready to hear from Brian O'Kelly. All right, Brian O'Kelly, inventor of header bidding. Why don't you tell me about the origin of header bidding? What was the context and the business problem that you were trying to solve, and how did you solve it?
Yeah, so in 2008, when we started thinking about pivoting AppNexus from being just a cloud platform into building real-time bidding, which was sort of this big idea, one of the questions was, how do we get access to inventory to bid on? And so having no access to Right Media at that time, and with Google still in the process of acquiring DoubleClick, there's really no way to bid on anything. And so to build a bidder, we had to build some way to hook a bid request into the programmatic ecosystem. And so if you can't get into the club, well, maybe find a back door. And so that was header bidding. We said, we'll just wrap the tag on page, the ad server tag, with JavaScript. And I figured out that you could pass key value parameters into the ad server. It seemed like a lot of work, but if in the ad server you could set up a line item that targeted a key value for each bidding increment, then I could effectively control the ad server through JavaScript. And then in that JavaScript on the page, I could do bidding. And so all of that work was so that I could build a bidder for eBay, so that eBay could bid on basically eBay users on web pages. So that was almost a Rube Goldberg device to get around the Google monopoly on the ad server.
Right, got it. So how did it work?
So in the header, if I said, hey, let's hold this auction, and MediaMath bid $1 and Invite Media bid $2, we needed some way to tell the ad server, hey, there's a $2 bid. And so we basically pass a keyword that was like 200. And then in the ad server, we'd set up a line that said, if keyword equals 200, then turn on this campaign or this lineup. And we'd prioritize those because the ad servers were priority based. We'd actually insert it, we'd rank it in the ad server hierarchically or like in a priority order. So any bid above, $1.80 would preempt these campaigns. But then you'd have another tier that was like, $1.50 to $1.70 or whatever. So you had this sort of hacking of waterfall and bids into the ad server. And so every line item has a priority in the ad server. And so if I wanted to set up a priority 3 line item, I could do that. But how would I connect that to a bid? So the way we did that was, and this is how header bidding works today, you'd have a key value that has the price, and you'd have a line item that's looking for that price. And the line item's function was to map to a priority.
Yep. So how does this become an antitrust issue?
What happened in the beginning to catalyze what we now see as the programmatic marketplace, there's this whole evolution, but the fundamental tension is Google owns the ad server. And if you asked me in 2007 why Google's DoubleClick purchase was dangerous, I would have said Google has now a tag on the page on every website in the world that controls all the monetization. That was like the number one value prop. We own tag on page. Actually, now header bidding is the tag on page. If you look at how the web worked in 2016, now you have header, which is actually in charge of what serves. It asks DoubleClick, it treats DoubleClick almost as a bidder in a way. And now you have the header as the tag on the page. Prebid.org has more traction than Google. So it's a deeply disruptive innovation. It takes away Google's ability to get first look on inventory. It takes away the ability of AdWords to bid on all the traffic. There's a chance that they're not seeing everything, or equally bad, everybody else sees it too. So when Amazon has a header bidding integration, they see every single placement on every single website. There goes Google's competitive advantage as an ad network. Because at the end of the day, all of this is about Google being an ad network. And it's a very, very big, very profitable one. It's $30 billion or something. So if you're basically saying, after all this work and all this effort and all this money that Google has invested in DoubleClick and everything else, some, rude dude in Brooklyn is going to wrap us with JavaScript and let Amazon get equal access to all this inventory. Well, that's dangerous. And what if Facebook does this? What if Facebook and everybody else can build competitive ad networks that just sit next to us? We don't want equal fair access to every impression. We want a competitive advantage. By the way, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's why fundamentally header bidding is threatening to Google, because it's taking away the strategic advantage of owning the ad server.
All right, so you have this proprietary thing called header bidding. Why do you open source it and share it with all your competitors?
Well, I mean, the idea of header bidding was always that you'd hold an auction of SSPs, ad networks, whatever, on the page. So I think the premise was open up bidding to, not be dependent on the ad server. And in terms of how it got open sourced, by the time it started, header bidding got real traction in the middle of the decade. Rubicon had a version, Pubmatic had a version, Index had a version, AppNext had a version, and publishers were getting pitched on, my header bidding is better than their header bidding. And that, of course, played to Google's strengths, which was let us all fight it out. And they could just say, hey, we're Google, trust us. And so I went to the other sort of SSP exchange players and said, guys, why don't we join forces? Why don't we just have one header bidding that is completely neutral and fair? It means we have to compete as exchanges, but we already do. But this way, we'll get massive adoption. And I'm a huge fan of industry frameworks. And we've been doing this in sustainability of, could we get an industry framework that makes the industry 100 times bigger? So rather than be the dominant player in a small proprietary ecosystem, why don't we be the leader in a much larger open industry ecosystem? That's exactly what we saw with viewability, with brand safety. It happened with header bidding. And header bidding is on every website in the world. Most apps have it. I mean, this is an amazing accomplishment for a renegade JavaScript hack, right? It's incredible. But it happened because open beats closed. Having an open platform is always going to beat a closed ecosystem. And Google saw it coming, and they responded with their open bidding, their meta auction you're talking about.
Yeah. So the antitrust complaint describes publishers making a lot more money after they adopted header bidding. What were you seeing and hearing during the period of rapid adoption from publishers and others with a financial stake in it?
Well, so one of the great benefits of having a closed exchange platform like Right Media was we could do fair second price auctions, which means there's no penalty for overbidding. If you bid $10 and I bid $1, you'd win for $1. And that meant you could express your full value. You could bid $1 million and
Right.
you'd still pay $1. So that's great for bidders. You don't have to be all that smart in that sense. But publishers are like, well, I only got $1, but that dummy Adam was willing to bid $1 million. Like, I want $1 million. So there's this interesting interplay between buyers and sellers in an auction. And so one of the problems was that in the header, we didn't know the final price. So we would actually bid our first price to Google as the ad server, but then there was no price reduction. So if we bid $2, we'd pay $2. When Google ran open bidding, they ran a second price auction. So if you bid $2, you might pay $1.30. But the problem was, because of all those key values I mentioned, the bids are still coming in at $2. And so a bid on the header at $2 might actually outprice a $2 bid coming in through open bidding. And so what publishers would find is that effectively, by pushing buyers to pay first price, they'd make a lot more money. In my example, $2 is a lot more than the $1.30. Now, buyers started to lower their bids to make up for that, but they're lowering their bids everywhere. So it's almost like first price against second price. And the first price bids were just crushing the second price bids because the auction was no longer uniform. It was no longer a fair closed auction. You have different dynamics. And so basically, I put some blogs up about this on Bach on Ads. I was like, we can't run an auction that's two different types. Like, it's super weird if it's partially a first price auction and partially a second price auction. And so one of the greatest advantages Google had, and Right Media, was they could actually run a second price auction. And I had this whole thesis, like, if I could convince Google to force them not to be the tag on the page and to lose their second price ability, it would destroy almost all the strategic advantage they had. And so, if you want to put in my, we all know I lost the war, right? But I'm like Robert E. Lee here. Like, I lost, but people thought I was a pretty cool general, right? So, but my big wins were, I got Google to switch from second to first price, and I undermined them as the tag on the page, right? And then they kicked my butt.
What's the advantage of running a second price auction as opposed to first?
Because if you can get buyers to trust you to express their full value, because the thing is, on my first price world, you would never bid $1 million. First of all, you don't want me to know you'd pay $1 million, right? That's actually really good signal. If you're bidding $1 million on this person, I'm like, oh, wow, that must be Bill Gates. Whoa, Bill Gates is on my site, right? Or Adam's a dumb bidder, but that's cool, right?
Yeah.
But now it's first price, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to bid shade. I'm going to bid $3. So you take away, because the thing for Google is, in a perfect world, if you bid $1 million for Bill Gates, and then, here comes Joe Zawadzki, he's like, I'm bidding $2 million. I'm not messing around, right? Well, Google's like, sweet, we just made $1 million CPM. And that's why on search, you get crazy bids for mesothelioma, right? Because there's all this competition for super high value keywords. They make so much money on these highly contested, family vacation to Cancun. They're going to print money, right?
Yeah.
How long is, the Eiffel Tower? Not a lot of bids, right? So that's the stuff you want concentrated bidding, and you want to know the full expressed value from the advertiser. So giving up second price means no longer finding out the true willingness to pay from your buyers. That's an incredible asset.
And then what happened?
Google's watching Gorilla Brian, I meant that with a UE, not an OR, but you can choose, doing all these things to try to undermine their strategic value. And they're trying to figure out what to do. And they're in an interesting position because they have all the assets. They control the browser, the operating system, the ad server, the biggest search engine, the biggest ad network, right? YouTube. And they have everything sitting around GAM. And the question is, which of these can we deploy in order to change the dynamics back to our favor? And I guarantee you, they've got lawyers sitting in their strategy meetings going, well, which of these are actually, ethical? Which of these are evil? They're not going to be evil, but it's just an interesting case. If you have absolute power, what do you do in order to protect your business, but also do the right thing from a moral, ethical, legal perspective? I think that it's, again, I think I was driving people at Google crazy because they could have obviously just stopped it. Like they could have just blocked keywords in GAM and been like, oops, we broke pre-bid. And to their credit, the fact that they didn't break pre-bid is pretty awesome, honestly. Like they could have, like one engineer could have at any day he wanted to just broken pre-bid. And what were people going to do? They were monopoly on the ad server. Like what is eBay going to do? Like, sorry, we're not going to use GAM. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, so that's where a lot of this comes from is I'm running, I think, a really smart guerrilla strategy, a challenger strategy. They're in this massive monopoly power position. What do you do? So what they did, and this is, I think, public, they went to Facebook and said, hey, what would it take for you not to do pre-bid? And there's some pretty cool emails with like Sheryl Sandberg being like, hey, Sheryl, are there any incentives you might have for using, arguably a commercial conversation, but, you got the two biggest players in the world conspiring against, an open source project and, and poor little me. And this would have really helped me if it were happening in 2016. Like had DOJ engaged then, I might still be running an ad tech company. So I don't have a horse in the race. I just really want to make sure we're not confusing, the market landscape and punitive response to Google for what they did versus how do we create the preconditions for an open internet that works and functions for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years.
If you want to do more research on Brian O'Kelly, AppNexus, and their role in Google Antitrust, check out Brian's testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee in May of 2019. He tells a story that is not told in this interview. Well worth checking out if you haven't, if you like hearing from Brian here and want to know more. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter under my own name. We'll be back for episode 3 in a few weeks. Maybe we'll do a little more on header bidding if people really love it and have a lot of questions. Otherwise, it'll be on to the complaint. Have a good one, everyone.